to the FY19 Volunteer Needs Assessment Overview. I'm Nancy Smith, a Director in the Disaster Workforce Readiness Unit, and I'll be presenting today along with Sarah Luan, who's the Workforce Engagement Manager for Michigan. We are recording this session today, so it can be posted in the Volunteer Needs Assessment area. So please mute your phone if you're not speaking, and we have a nice small group today, so we'll do questions as we go through various parts of the webinar here. So today we want to look at three areas. One is an overview of the volunteer growth strategy, which sets the stage for the volunteer needs assessment. Then we'll look at the needs assessment process itself, and then the disaster cycle services participation and resources to complete the needs assessment. The volunteer growth strategy started a few years ago in volunteer services throughout the entire enterprise in looking for more volunteers so that we could increase our mission and have the volunteers be the ones providing our mission throughout their local communities. And to do that, we began investing more in our volunteers and increasing resources, both in the Office of Volunteers, as well as training and different venues for the volunteers. We were hoping, and still do hope, that this leads to improved volunteer satisfaction and engaging volunteers in fundraising for the organization. So the needs assessment is really an extension of this. The annual planning for getting more volunteers to drive our mission and increase it, and our goal setting process. The needs assessment, as you all know, is kicked off at the beginning of the fiscal year, but is ongoing to assess our needs throughout the year, which is why we do a quarterly quick update. And the needs assessment should engage the regional leadership team, the executive directors, biomed, current leadership volunteers, to do some joint planning across the regional arena. So the growth strategy, and hence the volunteer needs assessment, is really looking for the right number of volunteer positions, getting the right number of volunteers to fill those positions, and the right engagement strategy and structure, which is where do we want to go, where do we want to increase our services and our mission and our programs, and then making sure that our volunteers have an effective engagement and are very satisfied. So that leads us to our needs assessment and the three phases in the needs assessment. The first one is an orientation to the needs assessment process, which should be your first orientation meeting conducted by the regional executive and the RVSO. DCS leadership should be in attendance, the RDO certainly, your workforce engagement manager certainly, the RDO's volunteer partner, and any others that the RDO thinks needs to be there to help with the outcome. The desired outcome of the orientation is to prepare departments and functional units to feel comfortable enough with the regional needs assessment, where they want to go, what kind of planning and volunteer needs you want to look at through the year, and get ready for the Phase 2 department meeting. The Phase 2 department planning meeting is one that the RDO conducts for the regional DCS leadership team and others that the RDO invites. This is where we really want to get into working with members of your department and functional areas to plan for where you are, where you want to go, what you have to get there, and what you need to get there. So we want to look at our tables of organization, the updated assessment action plans, see what volunteers you currently have in Volunteer Connection, making sure that our data is up to date so that we've got accurate information that we're looking at. You want to refer to the tip sheet that's in the Volunteer Needs Assessment Toolkit that we'll talk about in a minute, which has planning session pointers for you in setting up your meeting. And then you want to look at the pre-assessment report from Volunteer Services, which they should be providing to you before your meeting so that you can see how those things mesh and look at where you want to go. There's also an interactive planning map that's on the Volunteer Needs Assessment Toolkit. So I want to take a quick question here and ask you to raise your hands if you're familiar with the interactive planning map and whether or not your region uses it. So if you put on a hand there if you do. Right, nobody does. Sarah, do you want to take a minute and give them an idea of what is on the interactive planning map and how it could help them get ready for their meeting?
Sure. So as Nancy was saying, that interactive planning map can actually be found in the needs assessment, well, it's called the Regional Needs Assessment Toolkit on the Exchange. And it works kind of similarly to the mapping feature of RC View, where you can click on different layers to see different things, if you will. So I think the best part about this map is that it can show us where our volunteers lie within our regions, and you can choose to have it be a dot on the map, you can have it be a heat map, but it kind of just gives us a really quick, good view, physical mapping of what we have and where we have it. So it's real easy to look at that and say, oh, okay, I can see that this part of my region really doesn't have a lot of volunteers. Now then the question becomes, do I need volunteers in that area, and if so, how many? But it's going to give you a visual of where your holes are, and it's a lot of fun to play with. So if you get a chance to do so, I would definitely go in and check it out.
Thanks, Sarah. And then our department meeting and the results of our meeting lead us into the Phase 3 Regional Leadership Planning meeting. Again, the leadership planning meeting is the one where the regional exec and the RVSO with representatives from all line of business take every line of business volunteer needs, bring it together and make those final decisions on what are the priorities for the region, for each line of business. And this is where if there's a lot of negotiating going on and where we can identify synergies among the teams and opportunities to collaborate and work together and share a common understanding of the priority needs for the volunteer leadership and how your region is going to handle it. Currently, the dates of these different phases of the needs assessment are here on the screen, but I want to emphasize that the final date is driven by when the volunteer needs assessment tool is actually open for the RVSO to add the volunteer needs information for the region. Currently, that closes June 29th. So all of these dates are flexible as long as your RVSO is the one telling you when they need to have the completed information ready to do their data entry, which must be done by June 29th so that we can get that snapshot for July 1st in the beginning of the fiscal year. I'm going to now move into some of the tasks and the requirements that need to take place so that the department meeting can get down to business and make sure they're prepared before they go into their Phase 3 regional meeting. So, Sarah, do you want to start us with the cleanup preparation? Oops, let me finish this one first and then we'll get there.
I was thinking, wait a second, it's not my turn yet.
Yeah, no, it isn't. Sorry about that. Here's the Regional Volunteer Needs Assessment Toolkit resources. And again, this department planning tip sheet is very good. It has a sample agenda and discussions for you in there. And this is also where you can get the link to the Volunteer Needs Assessment Interactive Planning Map that Sarah was referring to. It really is kind of cool and can help answer some of the questions that you might have on where we need volunteers for next year. So here's our internal meeting agenda. And what we're going to do throughout the rest of some of this webinar is go over some of the session resources and materials you have. But the meeting objectives are to clarify and review the FY19 goals, review your steady state and disaster table of organization, your updated tables of organization, explore some volunteer opportunities and where you may want to go, and then look at the next steps on how to get to the next step of talking this over with volunteer services before you get to your phase 3 meeting with the regional exec. Once you get department things done, we want to meet with volunteer services and do a vetting of our key volunteer positions. Those would be your required positions, both that national requires as well as your regionally required ones. Talk about the outcomes of the meeting that you had with your resources. Go over the positions that you want to keep or archive. This should be part of the data cleanup that your workforce engagement manager and the team are doing. Decide on those priority positions within disaster cycle services, and remember those will then be brought up and negotiated with those priorities from the other lines of business, what your real desired number of volunteers are, and then a discussion and documenting of what the needs are. This is really that pre-state so that the RVSO and the regional exec can determine what their level of negotiation is going to be at that phase 3 meeting. We also want to look at the needs assessment summary report that volunteer services should be providing you at this point in time, which will give you a little history of where you are, what you asked for just, I know, only 4 weeks ago. And as we get going through the needs assessment and pick this up on the quarterly basis it's designed for, I think that'll make more sense. It'll also be much easier for folks if we continue maintaining our data cleanup. I know the workforce engagement managers and their teams have been doing a lot of work on the data cleanup as well as on the assessment action plan. And if we continue to maintain those, the needs assessment timeline and work that needs to be done for that will get much easier. So now we're going to look at those resources for you to plan the department meeting. Sarah?
All right. So a few weeks ago, we released our Disaster Cycle Services Business Unit Guidance. We've had guidance specifically for DCS with the needs assessment in the past. This year, we've kind of gone a little bit more in depth and a couple more tools for us to utilize. One of the things with the guidance is making sure that we understand that this is a continuation from year to year. It's going to be a maintenance and an update, if you will, throughout the year. So all of this information and all of the links to all the documents I'm going to be talking about can be found in our Engaged Volunteers and Employees Toolkit. There's actually a section specifically for the volunteer needs assessment. So you'll definitely want to go there and take a peek for yourself of these full documents. Nancy, if you want to move to the next slide. All right, so we're going to be talking about a few different things that are part of this business unit guidance. One of the first things is our cleanup and preparation. As I mentioned, this volunteer needs assessment is a continuation of the assessment of our current volunteer engagement. This is going to be something that will become second place to us. We'll be doing it all the time. It's going to be normal. We're going to be expecting those meetings. The disaster workforce engagement managers and their teams will need to be continuously cleaning up their data and updating their regional steady state table of organization and the regional disaster table of organization, which is that level 3 TO. And that assessment action plan is going to be one of those things that we're going to be utilizing a lot, and we are recommending that the DWE be the person that owns that process, making sure that that is updated at least each quarter, if not more than that. But some of the things that we're going to be looking at cleanup and prep for, specifically starting with associating all of our global position templates and those position descriptions on the back end of Volunteer Connection with the steady state as well as the operational positions, so those primary gaps within the Volunteer Connection profiles. So that should be well underway at this point, at least with the steady state positions. We understand that, you know, getting those primary gaps in as well is more of a lift. So we understand that people will continue to work on getting their operational positions created as well as associated with members' profiles. We want to make sure that we're looking at inactivations and or removing people from our lists that are no longer volunteering. And we want to make sure that we're doing that on a regular basis, so that way we're not doing a large-scale purge, if you will. We want to make sure that we're keeping up to date with our data and our need, if you will, if those volunteers are going to be leaving us or staying on, as well as updating that profile information, looking at the positions, correct data in the system, such as emergency contact information, updated qualifications such as driver's license numbers, any other certifications like mental health or health services, things like that. And those will be found usually on the data quality assessment that you may be pulled by your workforce engagement manager. Before we move to the next slide, is there any questions about the cleanup and preparation? All right, well, let's move to the next slide then. Talk a little bit about required positions. So we've mentioned a few times the assessment action plan. That's where we're going to find not only our required positions, but those optional positions for within the region for chapters. So we're going to want to make sure that we're looking at that steady state table of organization and the assigned regional disaster table of organization, whether you're a blue or you're a gold. And then you're also, at this point, we're going to be looking at and reviewing and updating our primary positions. So just because a position is required doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be a high priority. So we will talk a little bit more about that. So if you want to move to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about our priorities and the hows and whys of that. So in Volunteer Connection, there are technically 4 priorities: high, medium, low, and none. So how do we get to each priority is a question we're asked much of the time. So we want to make sure that those positions that are not able, so if we have a position that if we don't have anyone in it, we're not able to move the mission forward. So for example, if we don't have any DAP members in an area, we can't serve the mission. If we don't have sufficient leaders in an area to lead a program and we don't have any of those members, then those are going to be high priority because we're not going to be able to move the mission forward. So we're going to look at sufficient leadership and engagement of volunteers to complete onboarding, supervision, and the engagement once we've received those volunteers. It's going to be really hard to bring volunteers on in an area if we don't have anybody there to begin with. So we want to look at what positions we need to have the building blocks to sustain that portion of our program. Obviously, we need to have sufficient disaster action team and preparedness volunteers so that we can, again, conduct that day-to-day mission. We still are going to need to install smoke alarms. We're still going to need to teach pillowcase. We're still going to need to respond to local disasters. We're going to be looking at the steady state national headquarters required positions. And again, just because they're required doesn't mean that they're necessarily the high priority. For example, I like to use the recognition and appreciation volunteer lead as an example, where it's very important, yes, because it's going to help us move that portion of our program forward. It's going to spread that responsibility out. But if it's not there, it does not mean that we still can't meet our mission, because those portions are just going to be handled by other folks. So when we're looking at those priorities, high priority is going to be if I don't have it, I can't meet the mission. Medium priority could be one of those, like a recognition and appreciation lead, maybe you have a sheltering lead or a feeding lead. Maybe you have a mass care, but you don't have the other ones. That might be medium, because it can be a position where portions of it might be farmed out until you have that position filled. And then if we're looking at low, that's going to be a value added. So it's awesome if we have a full sheltering team in a county, that is their only responsibility. We know in all reality that a lot of times in those areas, our DAT teams are going to double as those shelter teams. So that may be a lower priority when we're going through. Unpriority could be one of those positions that might be a placeholder for a group specifically. I know some areas have a disaster service member, blah, blah, blah county, or blah, blah, blah chapter. That way they are all filtered into a group share so they can email all of their disaster volunteers at one time. Those we'll probably see as a non-priority, as they're not quite tied to that needs assessment. So make sure that we're looking at that, and also keep in mind some of those service associate positions that are listed on your level 3 table of organization. As last year, volunteer services did start assisting with recruiting for those service associate positions, and this is something that will continue on as well. So if you don't have any service associates in sheltering and you know that you can't open a shelter in your area because of that, that's going to be something that you may want to put down as a high priority. Are there any questions about that?
FY18 needs assessment and these required positions that we have labeled as high priority because we were under the impression that that is what it needed to be. So is that and clearly if we don't have them filled, then that's going to count against our targets there. So do you happen to know if it's too late to change those priority levels for the current, now that we know that we don't have to label them as high priority simply because they're required?
We can't go back and change the fourth quarter. This is newer, if you will, guidance this year that we decided on across all lines of service through our business unit guidance development. Now, a good point that you mentioned, going back and changing that. So let me just state that if we set a priority as high at the beginning, it's going to stay high throughout that life cycle of that fiscal year's needs assessment. So we're not going to be able to change that there because it will be tied to a metric, but this is the time that you're going to want to reevaluate those priorities moving forward for FY19. Does that make sense?
Wonderful. It makes perfect sense. Crystal clear. Thank you very much.
You are welcome. All right. If we want to move ahead, that would be awesome. All right. We did decide upon a methodology of this because we want to have a method to our madness. So one thing that will help us throughout the year as we're working on and looking at the needs assessment is if positions are filled, that we update our RSSTO and our RDTO. And we make sure that we're keeping up to date with that and using that as a living, breathing document. That's going to be very helpful for us at the end of each quarter when we do have our needs assessment meeting with volunteer services, that we're able to look at one of those spreadsheets and be able to print that off for them and or just copy that out and give it to them to show us where we are at our recruitment on that. A lot of those positions we're going to try to fill internally for leadership development. And at certain points, we may not be able to. We may have to look outside of the organization to do that. So we'll talk a little bit about that internal and external recruitment here in just a moment. We did talk a little bit about that ongoing maintenance and quarterly update of that RSSTO. It's all going to filter in. One of the things that is tied to that is the completion and monitoring of an individual training plan for each identified candidate. And we have some good news about that. Originally, those individual training plans were going to be due June 30th of 2018. That deadline has been pushed back, and they will now be due October 31st of 2018. So yay, that's awesome news. So everybody should still be working on them, but we won't, the requirement to have them done will be October 31st, 2018. So backing up to that recruitment, looking at internal and external recruitment was something that we wanted to think about as well with our methodology. So there's going to be items and there's going to be people that we need to recruit internally, whether or not we are building leadership or looking to fill some of our upper level positions. And then there's also going to be some internal positions that we may want to look at, some internal departments that we may want to tap into. So for example, let's say your region has a first aid team and they have a ton of nurses, and you're really struggling to find some nurses that are interested in coming in because you're not able to, when you open a shelter, you don't have enough nurses to staff it. You could work through volunteer services to reach out to that first aid team to see if they have nurses that would be interested in taking the training to be available to have a health services gap and assist in a shelter as health services is needed. That would be an internal recruitment. External recruitment is going to be that targeted outside of the organization recruitment. In the past, we saw a lot of passive recruitment by volunteer services. Starting very shortly, we're going to see a lot of very intentional and targeted recruitment as their roles are changing, and there will be specific specialists that are dedicated just to the recruitment of volunteers out in the field. Are there any questions about our methodology? Okay, if you want to move forward. So the release of the business unit guidance, we affectionately refer to it as the bug because business unit guidance is sometimes difficult to say. It's located in a couple places. There is a link to it. If you go to the Regional Volunteer Needs Assessment Toolkit, there's a link to our business unit guidance. You can also get to our business unit guidance through the Engaged Volunteers and Employees Toolkit on the Exchange. In there, you'll find the overall unit guidance that outlines everything that we're thinking about, and it'll go through that cleanup, the methodology, prioritization, and follow-up. There's also an implementation checklist that you'll be able to find that has specific dates specific to DCS. And again, remember those dates are ranges in order to be flexible enough for us to work through our processes. The hard date will be the closing of the portal, and that will be closed June 30th at the end of the day, so that July 1st, there are accurate numbers for some snapshots that will be taken, and that's going to be a volunteer services thing. So as Nancy mentioned, those dates will be agreed upon by you and your RVSO and may come down from the DVSE to that RVSO. There is also a document on maintaining accurate data in Volunteer Connection, which if we have people that are new to the cleanup process, it'll give them a jumping off point and give them some clear guidance on what needs to be cleaned up and why. And then also you'll also be able to get to a copy of the Assessment Action Plan job tool, but most of you are probably, if not all of you, should already be utilizing that within your region. So all of that information is at your fingertips on the Exchange. If you want to move forward to the implementation checklist. All right.
Sure, thanks, Sarah. I want to say one other thing about the business unit guidance. The information that we just covered specific for disaster is all contained on that 1.5-page sheet. So please access that, especially for the prioritization. Every line of business this year, and this is the first year we've had this, but all lines of business will have a business unit guidance document that are all posted on the regional volunteer needs assessment area. And they will all be going through the same types of things to bring their needs to the table on that phase 3 meeting, so that the region can have a good conversation about prioritization overall. The DCS implementation checklist is a combination of the dates and the activities that need to happen for the cleanup and updating of the assessment action plan, et cetera. What needs to be done before you can have your meeting, so that you've got all the information that you need at your fingertips before you get started. So you may want to look at that. We've changed the June 30th date for the candidates' individual training plans. The new one is already posted that says that they're due on Halloween. So use this as your guide as far as getting some of the tasks done that Sarah had mentioned. The other thing with the business unit guidance from all of the other lines of business within the organization is Biomed's coming to the table this year with a number of positions that they have determined as a line of business are priorities. So we'll need to really have some good negotiations going on in the region as to whether or not the priorities and the number of positions are needed. So we want to make sure that you're fully prepared to go in and engage in that conversation and look at what you had as a priority, as someone mentioned last fiscal year in 18 that we just finished, and change those priorities for FY19 as you go into this meeting in hopefully sometime in June. And by accomplishing these, you'll be ready for the phase 3 leadership meeting, in which there's an overview and some objectives on a regional basis as to what you want to accomplish at the meeting. But I wanted to make sure we went over number 3 and what the expectations are for the department rollout. One, to look at your business goals. The business goals will actually be entered in the volunteer needs assessment this year. What key leadership volunteers are needed, and your top priority operational volunteer needs. And that's operational for your line of business, not just operational for our regional disaster table of organization. This is what all the departments are bringing to the table. And then you'll look at the observations and come up with, out of all the volunteers that are needed, how many can volunteer services actually recruit at those various prioritization levels. So let's get into questions. You've got to have some questions. Everyone's got questions. Please ask them. Now's your time. Oh, one thing I promised I'd mention today. Once your workforce engagement folks get the assessment action plan updated and you go over that in your business meeting, that still needs to get to the phase 3 meeting and get to volunteer services to be entered into the actual needs assessment tool. We have some questions that have come back to us that some folks thought that once they updated the assessment action plan, they were done with the needs assessment. It needs to get to volunteer services so it can be entered in the needs assessment tool in volunteer connection. So questions?
Do you think that we're going to have the opportunity to see, I know last year we didn't really, or I didn't have an opportunity to see what other regions were doing to compare you know, to see where we stand on the numbers, to see if we're close to anyone else, or what other folks are doing. Is there a change in that to make it more visible?
I don't believe so. I'm not sure. We're trying to keep this so regionalized, and I'm not sure what access your RVSO has to the overall needs assessment tool either. Sarah, do you know, or does anyone else on the phone happen to know whether they can see other regions?
By region. I believe they can only see their own region, kind of like, and just in general, with Volunteer Connection, you can see the region that you're attached to unless you have Uber access. But again, yeah, as Nancy said, we're trying to keep it regionalized, because I think our biggest point in all of our meetings was that not one size fits all. But I wouldn't hesitate to reach out to some of your counterparts to ask them where they're at, just to kind of touch base with that. I can tell you that once they get turned into national, they do look at them across the board to see if anything stands out. And if one region is like, whoa, this region needs nothing, that's when we're going to get some pushback on that. But national does look at all of the needs assessments across the board, and they look at them by division. So what we're going to have is, so we're going to see the divisions looking at it regionally, then the division sends it up to national, and the national looks at it divisionally.
Okay, thank you.
We have a question in the chat. It's my understanding that not all of the global position templates are available for all of the GAP positions yet. Do you know when the rest of those will be available for use? That is correct. The position descriptions are in the global template for the blue and the gold disaster table of organization. And all the service associates positions. It's the remaining ones that are not yet completed and in the templates, which is primarily some manager, but chief positions and some of the ops management positions. Those should be in the global templates by the end of June for your use at that point in time. Another question on the prioritization about, are all prioritizations equal? No, each line of business came up with their own prioritizations that they want to use. Sarah went over ours for disaster cycle services. As I mentioned, Biomed has, I think it's at least one, if not two, of their positions that they believe should all be high priority. What disaster really pushed this year and what volunteer services is pushing is that the prioritization really needs to be at the region level, where you've got the players on who knows what positions they need, and volunteer services knows what they can accomplish in that amount of time. So it's really being pushed down to the region rather than across the board at some other level. That catches up with our chat questions. Anyone else have a question? Well, thank you very much for your participation today. If you do come up with a question when you get into the information, please don't hesitate to reach out. It's nancy.smith@redcross.org. And again, thank you, everyone.